Nonviolent civil disobedience is still a common and effective tactic that American philosopher John Rawls set out to clearly define in his writings. Despite the fact his definition faces criticism, Rawls' work highlights some key philosophical elements in his theory of justice and defense of civil disobedience. John Rawls defines civil disobedience as a non-covert, non-violent, public, and political act which encompasses a shared conception of justice. Though Rawls defined the term in a non-violent context, today's world has been experiencing an unprecedented number of violent protests all over the Middle East and North Africa, which begs the question when violence becomes necessary and what qualifies as violent under Rawls' definition. For example, a firefighter strike could be more unintentionally dangerous than a direct assault on a riot officer. Though violent civil disobedience should be kept aside as an absolute last possible resort, it is debatable whether it should be dismissed. According to Rawls' definition, civil disobedience is entirely a political act in a nearly just democratic system of government, as opposed to being a criminal act of self-interest. This distinction can be made by a minority communicating their actions to the broader political and social majority. An act of civil disobedience also must show fidelity to the law or willingness to accept the consequences. As emphasized by Martin Luther King, the exception of legal consequences can provide the minority with a moral high ground they would not have otherwise. However, what Rawls means by fidelity to the law can be somewhat misinterpreted. Since fidelity and legal assent are not inseparable, Gandhi gladly accepted all legal consequences, but did so without a sense of fidelity. Many philosophers write of a social contract between society and the rule of law. In the theory of justice, Rawls states from the perspective of human nature, people abide by shared principles of justice. These principles are 1. Basic liberties such as property, the right to vote, and the right to free speech, and 2. Social and economic conditions of inequality must benefit society as a whole. In other words, wealth and success must be accessible to all members of society. The United States suffers more social and economic inequality than most other developed countries, and the wealth of the ruling class elite will most likely never be available to the desperately poor due to a failing public education system and countless other factors. One could argue, in the United States case, Rawls' second principle has not been satisfied. Rawls lays out 3 conditions in order to determine whether civil disobedience is reasonable and how civil society should go about pursuing it. The first condition examines whether a law has exploited Rawls' first principle of basic liberties. The second condition states if avenues of civil protest have been unsuccessful and exhausted, civil disobedience becomes a reasonable course of action. The third condition, though somewhat unclear, states if a minority participates in an act of disobedience, an unrelated minority that shares the same degree of unfair treatment is also justified in their actions. Rawls describes the role of civil disobedience as a stabilizing device within a constitutional system, a device that ensures the 2 fundamental principles are evenly distributed and acknowledged by the political entities in power. Rawls and Badeau both agree that indirect civil disobedience is unjustifiable, which has led to arguments regarding the pros and cons of singling out unjust laws. If by Rawls' definition civil disobedience is a public act, and the consequences of breaking an unjust law are too severe for a minority to communicate their disapproval, other avenues of civil disobedience should be considered. Herbert Storing, one of the leading critics of the same nonviolent civil disobedience King fought to maintain, argued laws should be obeyed regardless of whether they're just or unjust. Storing questioned the concept of willingness to accept the punishment. He also dismisses civil disobedience as an irrelevant call to action in today's world, labeling an ineffective tactic that lies between civil protest and nonviolent revolution. Though Storing makes a strong argument, civil disobedience is still practiced in many parts of the world. Rawls would tackle Storing's argument by defining civil disobedience as a necessary, yet situational act, which should be committed when certain aspects of a government demand reform, and the legal aspects are just to the point where the perpetrators can withstand the consequences, allowing a public appeal to the majority. Though Rawls clearly defines the principle of equal liberty, critics such as Pete Singer are quick to criticize Rawls' dismissal of convictions not associated with shared conception of justice, such as religious and morals, calling it too narrowly defined. Though religious and moral views are relevant to justice in some cases, under certain conditions they play a motivational role in a minority's pursuit of recognition. The Montgomery bus boycott, for example, was in part motivated by King's religious beliefs. Revolutionary action and militant protest may be the only course of action to end, or at the very least reduce, the widening gap between the rich and poor. But until that day, defining civil disobedience and its role can help exploited minorities remold unjust aspects of democracy and help remind us of how just political systems operate.